So it's been about 2.5 months since the Nintendo Switch 2 has released into the world, and it's been a very interesting launch thus far. Today, I kind of want to focus on something that you can't really have a discussion about this on Twitter because of insane console fanboyism, but I feel like on YouTube there's a bit more nuance and you could kind of have a more normal discussion about this. And I kind of want to focus on third-party games on the Switch 2 because there is a sort of brewing concern when it comes to third-party games on the Nintendo Switch 2 that things might end up being similar to how third-party games were on the original Nintendo Switch. We obviously had some standout titles when it came to third parties. We obviously had some mediocre titles. We had some absolutely horrible, unplayable games released for the Nintendo Switch 1 when it came to bigger third-party releases. And when you look at the holiday lineup for the Nintendo Switch 2, there are quite a few larger third-party games that are coming to the Switch 2. Now, some of these games were available to play at Gamescom, and we've been kind of getting mixed reports on some of these titles. So I kind of want to talk about like the reasoning behind this because I don't think it's quite as clear-cut as people are making it out to be. It seems like there's two sides of camps here, and it's either the developer is being lazy with the Switch 2 version, and that's why it's not good, or the other side of the camp is, oh, well, the Switch 2 is just too weak to run these games, and like, that's it. You're on that side or the other side, and there is no sort of middle ground with this, but I definitely don't really see it that way. I think there is a lot more nuance that goes into things like this, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about in today's video. So we've had some good third-party ports on the Nintendo Switch 2 thus far. I would say some of my favorite ones, or at least the most quality ones in my opinion, are games like Street Fighter 6. You know, I think it looks great. I think it plays great when you're actually doing the fighting of the game. Yes, the World Tour mode is at like 30 frames per second, but I don't want to play that anyways. I just want to play the normal fighting game. That's why I purchased this game. Cyberpunk 2077, all things considered, I think is a very impressive port on the Nintendo Switch 2. WWE 2K25 as well. I think it's just as good almost as the other versions of the game when it comes to, you know, the frame rate and the graphics. Yes, it's missing some graphical effects that are available on the Xbox Series and the PlayStation 5. But for the most part, it's a very accurate experience to how it should be. And then we've had some third-party ports that aren't as good. I'm not going to sit here and argue with people about Madden 26, but Madden 26 is not exactly a great third-party port. And with newer games coming out, you know, there is this kind of concern growing. We've heard things from, you know, Gamescom about games like Elden Ring. And, you know, we talked about how Bandai Namco was not allowing people to film their Elden Ring experience. It was essentially broken in handheld mode. Since then, we've gotten some footage coming out of events in Canada that was off-screen footage of people playing the game in docked mode. And like it looked like Elden Ring, but it looked like a jankier Elden Ring. And I know I'm not a huge Elden Ring fan, but I did give a very honest effort when the game first came out. And this definitely looks a lot jankier than it did on the PlayStation 4. Like, I don't really think anyone can argue with that. There's obviously some frame rate issues that are happening when you turn the camera or when you move or something like that. Stutters are happening, and it just doesn't look like a very appealing port. Now, of course, this could be an older port. Maybe they've ironed out some of the kinks with this, but since this is a 2025 game and this is what they brought to Gamescom, I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. You also have games like Final Fantasy VII, which seem to be getting a lot of positive press. You know, people seem to be very impressed with it. Of course, we did have some people at the booth giving misinformation about the frame rate and stuff like that. You know, allegedly it was 60, now it's 40. It might be 30. We're not quite sure. It seems like there could be several different modes for the game, though. Potentially a performance mode and a quality mode. But a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake, like, it doesn't really necessarily need, like, you know, the highest frame rates available or something like that. As long as it looks good and it feels good and it's solid and consistent and not fluctuating all over the place, I think that's fine. But then you have games like Star Wars Outlaws and Borderlands 4. Star Wars Outlaws looks terrible. We haven't seen much from it, but there is a video over on IGN of like a developer interview where they actually showed some gameplay, like some combat of the game, and it looked like it was going at 15 frames per second. Borderlands 4 is also available to play at Gamescom as well on the Nintendo Switch 2, and there's been mixed reports. Some people say, oh, it's okay. Some people say, oh, it's not good. You know, when there's more than 4 enemies on the screen, the frame rate bogs down. There's input lag and stuff like that. And, you know, it's hard to say with that game. We've heard things about FC Club 26 being 30 frames per second, which of course is the soccer game coming out on the Nintendo Switch 2. So that Frostbite engine with Madden. Sonic Crossworlds along with Borderlands 4 for the Nintendo Switch 2 are coming out later than the other versions of the game. So I guess the question that a lot of people have right now is, why are these just all over the place? You know, it doesn't seem like there's any sort of consistency when it comes to these games and the quality and the performance of these games. Some of them seem to be, you know, overshooting their target and succeeding. Some of them seem to be undershooting their target and failing. And I don't think it's a situation where it's a lazy developer or the system just isn't strong enough to handle it. I feel like there is some nuance here. And I think a lot of that nuance comes into the, you know, 2 real areas of this. And I'm not a game developer or anything like that. I don't ever claim to be a game developer. I'm not an armchair developer, but I do have a general understanding of how these things kind of work. And one of the main things I think plays a role in this is how long these companies have had their dev kits. Because obviously some companies have had dev kits longer than other companies have. And it kind of reminds me a bit of a situation with the Xbox 360 and particularly Madden 06 on the Xbox 360, because that was the first Madden game to come out on the next gen consoles at that time frame. And Madden 06 looked great, but it had none of the features of the normal Madden 06 on PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. And that was a situation where, you know, they didn't have the Xbox 360 dev kit long enough to implement everything. And then the next year, everything was fine. And I almost feel like that's the case when it comes to the EA games, is that, you know, you haven't had the dev kit long enough to make a fully optimized version, but you want to be there in the launch window. You want these games to come out because you know people are going to buy these games. So you kind of rush them out there in hopes of, by next year, you figure out how to get Frostbite working properly on the Nintendo Switch 2. I am very curious to see NBA 2K26 on the Switch 2, because with 2K's track record with WWE 2K25, I expect this game to be 60 frames per second. And yes, it might not have all the bells and whistles in terms of lighting and stuff like that, you know, NBA 2K26 will have on the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X, but I expect this to be a very competent version of the game. And 60 frames per second, I fully expect that to be there because this is the current gen version of the game, not the last gen version of the game. Games like Borderlands 4 are kind of a bit more of an interesting topic. And once again, I think it comes down to them not having the dev kits long enough. Like, yes, there are going to be restrictions when it comes to, like, you know, raw power and stuff like that. But companies are going to have to learn how to utilize this system in order to get the most out of it. You know, doing things like DLSS. It seems like a lot of games that have been announced and that are coming out that are third-party games, we haven't heard a peep about these games using DLSS, which is kind of weird because that's one of the main key focuses that makes the Switch 2 an interesting system, because it allows you to not have to, you know, handle as much on the hardware side of things, and you can use the DLSS to make things look and run better. Yet, it seems like none of these companies are really fully utilizing that yet, which kind of leads me to believe that some of these games are being a bit rushed because of the launch window. But more importantly, they haven't had their dev kits long enough to really mess around with that sort of stuff. I expect yearly entry games to be better in terms of what happens next year. Like Madden 27, FC 27, I expect those games to be light years better in terms of performance than what we're going to get on the Nintendo Switch 2 with the initial games, because now you have additional time to check these games out. When you see games like Borderlands 4 and Sonic Racing Cross Worlds that are coming out later on the Switch 2, all that does to me is scream, hey, they haven't had their dev kits long enough to really fully mess around with stuff and get these games to a optimal state on the system. And it's kind of a decision that Nintendo made for whatever reason to kind of do a weird rollout of the dev kits. Like, we know that there are still developers out there that are main big AAA developers that still don't have a Nintendo Switch 2 dev kit, so they're not able to put their games onto the system. It's a weird decision that Nintendo made, but I don't think it's necessarily like doom and gloom for all third-party games on the Switch 2. I think it's going to be similar to how the Switch 1 was, but a smaller gap in terms of like the quality of these games. I think there's always going to be rushed ports, bad ports, unoptimized ports that come out on the Switch 2. 100%. Like, it's just kind of the nature of the beast. But I do think you are going to see games, especially a year or so from now, once developers have really had a lot of time to sink their teeth into the dev kits of the Switch 2, to where like you're going to be impressed. You know, I'm not ready to freak out about it. I know a lot of people on social media are freaking out. Oh, all third-party games are going to suck on the Switch too. You know, if they're already hitting problems now, then, you know, what about the newer games that come out and stuff like that? And I don't really think that's how it works. I think it's more so an issue of just how much time you've had to create this game on the system versus how long you've had to create this game on other platforms. If you've had 3 or 4 years to make a PlayStation 5 version of a game and 6 months to a year to have a Nintendo Switch 2 version of the game, which do you think is going to be more optimized? Which do you think is going to be a better performing experience on their respective platforms? I mean, obviously, the more time you have, the more you can tinker around with stuff. And it's something to monitor, though. You know, I fully think this is something worth monitoring to see how everything works out, but I'm not worried about it yet. There's going to be shitty ports. There's always going to be shitty ports on Nintendo platforms, but I think the quality ones should be well respected. I think the quality ones should be kind of the standard that other companies are aiming to hit. And I think that we will see more high quality ports, you know, from other companies on the Nintendo Switch 2. It's just going to take a little bit of time. It all matters when these companies got their dev kits, really, at the end of the day, and just how much work they're willing to put into potentially a later port of a game that has already sold on another platform. Is it really worth it? You know, stuff like that. But anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Like I said, this is a toxic minefield on Twitter. People just talking out their ass. And I think it's so stupid. Like, it's a very nuanced conversation at the end of the day. And I think the fact that, you know, there's been really good ports and then there's been questionable ports already should just show you that there's more than meets the eye with this. But, you know, people like to run with narratives and stuff like that, which is fine. You do what you want to do, homeboy. I don't really care. I'm just kind of adding a little bit of perspective to this. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. If you are new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. Be sure to like, comment, and share. Give me your thoughts in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.